Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to Bring On the Bad Guys, the show where we look at the most nefarious villains in comic book history. Today we're going to look at villains that first faced the X-Men in the 1960s, which means they had to appear in the X-Men comic magazine. The X-Men are a little more straightforward than some other 60s Marvel heroes in that they only had their own magazine and, of course, the annuals. So, much easier for us to narrow it down to the proper villains. So without further ado, we head to number 10 on our list, who might surprise you. Number 10 is the Changeling, aka Kevin Sidney. He first appeared in X-Men number 35 in August of 1967. His place of origin is still unknown, but he is of the planet Earth, and he was created by Roy Thomas and Werner Roth. Power scale, quick review again. 5 categories, 5 points each. Personality, powers, and mythology are the top 3, and then design and cultural impact. Most of those are self-explanatory. Mythology is everything that takes place in the pages of comic books. Cultural impact is everything that takes place off of them. So personality, we have a 3 for the Changeling. Powers, 2. He's a shapeshifter. He can take any form he pleases. More or less, he can't, turn into a giant, but something that resembles at least his basic physical form. Mythology 3, design 1, cultural impact 3. Now, this is a very interesting choice for our first villain in that he didn't last very long at first. He was second in command to a villain called the Mutant Master, who gathered a team of mutants together to allegedly take over the world, but then was found out to actually be an alien who wanted to actually take over the whole world and was just using mutants against humans to kind of thin the herd. So Changeling was the Mutant Master's lieutenant and betrayed the Mutant Master along with the rest of the group called Factor 3, which was the terrorist group that the Mutant Master founded. So once Changeling and his fellow mutants found out that the Mutant Master was actually an enemy to mutants as well as humans, they all rebelled against him and helped the X-Men take him down. And much, much later, the 1990s to be specific, the creators of the X-Men animated show, the classic 90s X-Men show, they wanted to create a sense that this superhero show was going to be a little different. It wasn't necessarily going to be dark, but it was going to have more serious elements. So they decided that they wanted to add a character death very early on in the series. So they chose a character who also died in the 60s, who is the Changeling. So after the Mutant Master fell, Changeling disappeared and showed up later telling Professor X that he had cancer. He had 6 months to live, and he wanted to do something good with his life as opposed to all the evil that he had done already. Professor X told him that he had a scheme that required the professor to go underground, do some behind-the-scenes work, and he had the Changeling masquerade as Professor X for a significant amount of time, and then Professor X, quote-unquote, passed away. It was actually Kevin who did that instead of the professor, and of course the professor came back much later to the shock of most of his students. So if you've seen the animated show from the 90s, you take a look at this picture here and you'll notice the similarity, but the creators of the animated show couldn't use the word Changeling because it was in use by DC. They were calling Beast Boy Changeling at that point. So they called the character Morph and added them to the initial X-Men roster in the 1992 animated series. Morph was supposedly, to viewers, killed in the first storyline, which was Night of the Sentinels, and created the rift between Cyclops and Wolverine right away. And they actually had to bring him back because he had such a big fan following. So he was brought back as a villain, serving Mr. Sinister, and then was able to break free of Sinister's control, return back to the good side, and fight along the X-Men for another time or two. but never quite returned to being a regular. So that's kind of the really cool cultural impact of Kevin Sidney, the Changeling, and that's why he gets a 3 as far as that goes. Design, he had probably the ugliest helmet in maybe Marvel history, least of all Earthlings, which is why he gets a design of 1. And when he later gets the classic X-Men blue and gold suit, of course, it's actually in the animated series, so not even in his first appearances here. Mythology 3, again, mostly just because of, the classic bait and switch. Oh, here's the professor, he's dead. Oh, he's actually a former villain, and it was done actually really well and really smoothly. And he has shown up a little bit in the pages of the books since then, but not really so much. So he gets a 3. Powers 2, again, he's just a shapeshifter. He can only possess the powers of other people if they are part of their physical appearance. So, for example, he could shapeshift into the Angel from the X-Men and fly because Angel has wings. He could shapeshift into Beast and have agility because it's mostly based in Beast's muscles and physiological structure. If he took Cyclops' place, he likely couldn't replicate the optic blasts, for example. Personality 3, kind of a one-note lackey to begin with, but again, he has the conversion and drifts over to the good side, so personality 3 there. So 12 points for the Changeling. Number 9, here we get to quote-unquote actual villains. We have Mesmero. And Mesmero, it's kind of funny, the first few villains here have some pretty bad headwear / tattoos as kind of a history, but some of them have moved on, at least somewhat. Mesmero's real name is Vincent something, kind of like Wolverine. We don't know his full name. I guess now we do, but early on we didn't know Wolverine's full name aside from Logan. He first appeared in X-Men number 49 in October of 1968. He's somewhere from the planet Earth, but is our second consecutive villain here that we don't know where he came from. He was created by Arnold Drake, Don Heck, and once again Werner Roth. And he is a master hypnotist. He's probably, at least on the planet Earth, the most powerful hypnotist in the Marvel Universe. But again, we're talking hypnotism here, which isn't necessarily the most powerful mutant gift. Personality 3, he has always kind of felt sorry for himself, but he has a touch of genius and of planning and charismaticness, if you might call it that. So he sits at a 3 for personality. Powers, his greatest claim to fame is making the entire X-Men team believe they were carnival performers, so his hypnotism is very powerful and very mind-eclipsing, might be a way to put it. But, again, not too much past the hypnosis. Some slight, maybe, mental suggestions in the form of telepathy, but not really on the same level as someone like, I'm going to say Professor X, but he's one of the most powerful ones, so just not a very powerful telepath. Design 1, and again, we're talking about the headwear. He has this almost bonnet-like headpiece that he wears early on that slowly morphed into more of a head tattoo, which looks a lot better, but still not great on the design front. Mythology, also a 2. He's never really stood out for an extended period of time as a big villain. He began his career as a stage hypnotist, using his mutant power for, personal gain. He worked for Magneto for a while, and he also has worked alongside some other X-Men and Marvel villains. But not really a lot of huge story arcs that feature him as the main villain, so only a 2 for mythology. Cultural impact, he does get a 3. His most significant role outside comics was in the animated X-Men Evolution show. He was one of Apocalypse's henchmen, and he was the one that Apocalypse sent out to the various corners of the Earth to abscond with artifacts needed to bring Apocalypse back to full strength. He also showed up in Ultimate Spider-Man, the animated series. So that is Mesmero at number 9. At number 8, we have the Vanisher. And the Vanisher's real name is Telford Porter. And if you abbreviate that down, you'll get Teleporter, which sounds a lot like teleporter, which is what the Vanisher actually does. His first appearance was in X-Men number 2, Volume 1, of course. So the second X-Men comic ever printed. November 1963 is when that happened. He hails from Milton, Massachusetts in the USA and was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. His personality gets him a 3, and that's more because he's not a pushover when it comes to his wit and his tongue, and he's very willing to get into a scrap as far as telling the police what's for and all that fun stuff. And his first line, as is shown here, is, "There's no law against wearing a costume and you know it." And then he taunts the police, steals some stuff, vanishes, which is teleporting. So classic Vanisher there, as no one knows. Powers 2, he's a teleporter. That's about it. Mythology 3, his greatest claim to fame is probably that he is the second villain to ever appear against the X-Men, of course, after Magneto. And he's never really been a tremendous problem, but has arose here and there as a worthy nemesis of the X-Men. So his first scheme was stealing top secret information from the U.S. government, holding it for ransom. X-Men stopped him. He was a part of Factor 3, which we talked about with the Changelings profile. And then he's also had some significant roles in House of M, Second Coming, Age of Apocalypse, and the Messiah War. So he's shown up at some key times in X-Men history. He also showed up in the animated series Wolverine and the X-Men. We're jumping down to Cultural Impact here, where he gets a 3. And he has a very, very, very short cameo in the movie Deadpool 2, where he's actually played by Brad Pitt, who shows up for a second as he's electrocuted. Otherwise, he is invisible. They kind of change his power set from teleportation to invisibility for Deadpool 2, and his presence is kind of played as a joke. Not kind of, it is. Design 2, again, he had a weird hood-type looking headpiece in his first few appearances. It looks like he's almost wearing a hoodie that doesn't fit him, so really awkward looking, but much like Mesmero, that evolved into more tattoos and masks and such. Looks a lot better now, so his design gets a 2. Marked improvements, of course, later on. Moving to number 7, we have Sauron. And no, not the Dark Lord. Although the funny thing is about Sauron is when I was young, I wasn't familiar with Lord of the Rings. And I was familiar with X-Men. So when I first started learning about Lord of the Rings, I was like, hey, this guy's got the same name as the pterodactyl guy from X-Men. And of course he does, because we'll find out here in a second. But Sauron's real name is Dr. Karl Lykos, and he first appeared in X-Men number 59 in August of 1969. He's yet another character that we don't know the origin place of, aside from planet Earth. And we do know that he had some adventures in his childhood in South America, but we don't know if that's actually where he comes from. He was created by Roy Thomas and Neil Adams. For personality, Sauron sits at a 2, and that's more or less because as a human, he's very smart. As Sauron, the pterodactyl man, he doesn't quite retain necessarily all those smarts all the time and is very animalistic. So personality is a 2. His powers are a 3, and he has quite the range of superpowers. Of course, he can fly because he is part pterodactyl. He can absorb life forces and energy from people. He uses his eyes to hypnotize, which is where he decided to take the Dark Lord Sauron from Middle-earth as his moniker, because Sauron's eye, hypnotized, brought under his power and such. Superhuman strength, agility, and durability, and a sonic scream, fire breath. He can also detect mutants, and that's kind of shifted throughout the years, but he can track mutants. And he's another kind of Jekyll and Hyde type character that we get, in that his mythology is just a 2, so it's kind of standard, but some interesting stories. So his origin is that he accompanied his family on a scientific expedition in South America, and when I say South, I mean very, very, very South America. He ends up getting attacked by pterodactyls, that we didn't know existed at the time, in deep, deep forests of South America. If I was saying South Africa, I meant South America the whole time. And that activated his mutant gene, and he was then able to transform into this pterodactyl beast. He also spent some time treating Cyclops' brother Alex, who is, of course, Havoc, and was friends with Charles Xavier, which is why he was doing that. He usually sticks around in the Savage Land, which is where the X-Men come into contact with him a lot. Usually doesn't quite play as big of a role against other Marvel heroes because of his tendency to stay in the Savage Land, which is actually in Antarctica, for those of you who may not be well-versed. He does play a pretty significant role in House of M and Age of Apocalypse, which are 2 huge, more recent X-Men storylines. He gets a design score of 4 because, let's face it, a human pterodactyl hybrid just looks really cool. He's had some really great artwork done over the years with his pterodactylness and talons, as Napoleon Dynamite would probably point out. So really, really cool looking villain. Cultural impact gets him a 3. He has shown up a couple times in video games, in Marvel Heroes, which was online and now, of course, defunct, and X-Men Legends 2. He showed up as a villain in the 90s X-Men animated series, as well as in Hulk and the Agents of Smash. And both of those involve him and the Savage Land, of course. So that gets him a total of 14. We go to number 6, and it is The Blob. As a kid, one of my favorite songs was Beware of the Blob from the old black and white monster flick. So I also really liked the villain, the Blob, as a kid. He first appeared in X-Men number 3 in January of 1964, and his real name is Fred Dukes. He hails from Lubbock, Texas in the U.S., and was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And the Blob is known for being really big and also not being the brightest bulb in the shed, so his personality remains a 2. He barely scrapes away from a 1 because he, unlike someone like Rhino, is capable every once in a while of conducting his own schemes. Not a lot. He tends to have a lot more success working with other villains, but he just barely edges into a 2 as far as personality goes. Powers, he gets a 3. So the interesting thing about the Blob is, on the surface, he just looks really big, and you might think, oh, he's really heavy. That's why he can't be moved. He's big, fat, whatever. He actually generates a personal gravity field, which makes him immovable. So he's kind of the opposite of the Juggernaut, in that the Juggernaut is unstoppable, the Blob is immovable. So the unstoppable force meets the immovable object, and Blob is the immovable object. So he, while using that personal gravity field, also has a certain level of invulnerability while he's using that. And he also has some levels of superhuman strength. However, that is not quite at the same level as someone like Juggernaut or Colossus, or even Iron Man in his armor. Might be more comparable to Blob, but that is also related to his mutant power and his physique. Mythology, that's a 3, and he first shows up as a quote-unquote circus freak in the X-Men magazine. The X-Men go to recruit him, specifically Cyclops, and the Blob's like, nah, not really interested. He's later recruited by the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, Factor 3, and Freedom Force, and a lot of bad guys. So he's worked with Magneto, Mystique, Toad. Almost every X-Men villain has had some sort of interaction with the Blob. He has some notable roles in Age of Apocalypse and Decimation. Those are both X-Men storylines. And he also shows up in the Marvel Noir universe. His design is a 2, primarily because he just looks like a big, fat guy. Not really a lot to look at there. And some pretty ugly renditions of the Blob have shown up over the years. And I can't really blame the artists because he's the Blob. Cultural impact is a 4. Blob is one of those villains that, even if you don't know a lot about him, you have heard of if you're even a casual comic fan. So there's that. There's also his appearances in the live-action films, X-Men Apocalypse. He is in. Kevin Durand plays him in the awful X-Men Origins Wolverine film. In video games, he is in the classic 92 X-Men arcade game, in X-Men Reign of Apocalypse, X-Men Legends, X-Men Origins Wolverine, which is actually a better video game than the movie is a movie. He's a playable character in Lego Marvel Superheroes and a boss that you have to defeat. He has also shown up in every major X-Men cartoon series. So Blob always seems to be around to be wary of. 14 is his total, and he sits at number 6. Going to number 5, we have Mastermind. And he actually gets into a tie with our next character, but we'll go with Mastermind first. And Mastermind, I actually believe, is a bit underrated. His real name, at least that we know of, is Jason Wingard. That's at least the name that he first goes by when we meet him, which is in X-Men number 4. So a lot of very early X-Men magazines here featuring these villains. March 1964 was when that comic was released. And another person that we don't know where he came from, really, because he is so good with his illusions. We're not really sure, for example, what his real accent is, what, maybe even his real, facial expressions are his other physical characteristics. Not quite sure. Maybe illusions, maybe not. I'm not really sure. So he was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And we get to the power scale here. Personality 3, and Mastermind kind of waffles between this kind of swarmy, rich-looking, aristocratic appearance and this kind of disgusting-looking pencil-thin mustache, kind of dirty, homeless almost-looking character. So it just kind of depends on how he wants to be perceived. And as much as his physical hygiene might leave something to be desired, his mental hygiene is always very sharp, although not quite to the level where he's able to coordinate large teams. He's more of a lackey, but a very smart lackey. Knows how to put on a good face, as they might say. Mythology 4. Actually, I skipped Powers. Powers 3, he can generate illusions and has a limited amount of mental manipulation. And that actually leads us right to Mythology, which is 4. Mastermind had a huge role in the Dark Phoenix saga. So it gives you an idea of how strong his mental illusions could be when he's actually able to keep Jean Grey under his grasp. And he's working for the Hellfire Club at that point with Sebastian Shaw and Emma Frost. And they, of course, don't show up until the 70s, but Mastermind has his illusions in place even back in the early days of X-Men. And as you know, probably Jean Grey is one of the most powerful mutants on the planet, and to keep her under his thumb is quite a feat. So that's where his powers sitting at 3 go, even though they're not, by the book, incredibly amazing powers by definition. Design 3, and again, that kind of bounces back and forth between how he looks either rich with mutton chops or poor with scraggly, unkempt hair. So it's kind of a crapshoot, whatever he decides to look like. So that's why he sits right in the middle at a 3. He's another character that joined up with the Mutant Master and the Vanisher and the Changeling, and that's another story of masterminds. And he's also shown up as we move to cultural impact in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Of course, the classic 90s X-Men animated show where the Dark Phoenix saga plays out. And he has shown up in the X-Men Marvel anime show. He's a playable character as well in Lego Marvel Superheroes. He hasn't really shown up in many video games because his power set is more mental than physical, so it doesn't always make a great playable character. But he gets a 16 for his total score. So that puts him at number 5. And actually bouncing back, see, we have 16 for Mastermind, 16 as well for number 4, Toad. So those two are technically tied. I put Toad first because I actually like Toad a little more. Not sure why, really. Maybe because he's less of a really creepy looking guy and more of a just weird looking. I don't know. I'm not really sure why Toad comes first. But his real name is, I know why I was, because his name is classic Marvel name, Mortimer Toynbee. That's right, that was enough to get him listed first ahead of Mastermind here. He first appeared in X-Men number 4 in March of 1964, and we know where he comes from. York, England in the UK, and he was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And Toad is one of those villains that is a forever lackey, you might say. He works for Magneto a lot, works for Mystique a lot. Not really a villain that strikes out on his own as much. However, we have his personality at 3 because in later books he did develop more of a wit and more of a rapport that went along with his fighting style. So he may, exchange quips with someone like Spider-Man or the Human Torch or Iceman, who is actually part of the X-Men. So while he's not a leader by any means, his personality has definitely gotten a lot more refined since the 60s and early 70s, where he basically just followed Magneto around like a puppy. His powers are a 3, and you might say, why does he get 3? Like, why does someone like Toad get powers of a 3 as opposed to when you're looking at previous people who seem a lot more intimidating as far as their power set goes? And as I list them, you're probably not going to really start changing your mind. Prehensile tongue, yuck, gross. Venom secretion, also gross. Agility and endurance, yeah, okay. But an interesting thing about Toad is he also has superhuman reflexes and healing factor, not quite to the same extent as someone like Wolverine or Deadpool, and has limited wall crawling and scaling abilities. So while on a sheet of paper, Toad's power set may not seem that intimidating, imagine going up against someone who can crawl along walls. So not quite Spider-Man, but Spider-Man-like. The super strength obviously isn't there, but the dexterity and athleticism is. And he has a prehensile tongue, so he can whack you in the face with his tongue, use it to grab you and throw you around, and also the tongue can be coated in venom. So a really gross villain to have to fight, but also a more difficult fight than you might first think when you're thinking of Toad. Mythology 3, and whoops, excuse me, I hit the wrong button. Mythology is a 3, and again, he's the classic Toady. As you can tell by his name, Magneto, also not a huge fan of him, as, again, follows Magneto around like a little puppy. But he's shown up in a lot of key X-Men stories. Second Coming, X-Men Forever, New X-Men, Dark Reign. He's been part of the Brotherhood for almost every iteration ever since the start, whether that be the Brotherhood run by Magneto or by Mystique or other characters. So Toad's been around. Design 3, and if we went across his early design, we probably wouldn't really stick at 3, but in the early 90s when the new quote-unquote X-Men series came about and sold tons of copies, he got the more classic, almost gesture-like look, and that's really become iconic for Toad over the years. So he does get a 3 as far as that goes. And a lot of props to modern Marvel artists for taking a very gross, dumpy, frumpy looking character and making him look really menacing. So that's why he gets a 3 for that. Cultural impact 4. Of course, his greatest claim to fame is probably in the first X-Men film when Storm asks him probably the most infamous line in comic book movies. Nope, I'm wrong. That's the Martha line. But at least the most infamous line in the X-Men films. Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else, which one of the worst lines ever written in movie history. But that's what Toad is probably, unfortunately, best known for, and it's not even him that's saying it. And, of course, the context is that he's fighting Storm and the X-Men on the Statue of Liberty, and Toad's about to fall, latches on with his tongue to a metal beam, and Storm zaps him. So, yeah. He's also shown up in some future X-Men films, too, Days of Future Past. He shows up, and I believe perhaps Apocalypse as well. Can't quite remember on that one. In the animated realm, Spider-Man and his amazing friends had Toad show up. Pride of the X-Men, of course, the classic animated series, X-Men Evolution, Wolverine and the X-Men, Superhero Squad. X-Men Mutant Academy is one of the video games he's been in. X-Men Legends, X-Men Destiny. He's a playable character in actually both X-Men Legends 2 and Lego Marvel Superheroes. So that earns him a 4 for his cultural impact, for a total of 16. Moving to number 3, we have the Juggernaut. And the Juggernaut first appeared in X-Men number 12 in July of 1965. And his real name is Cain Marko. He is originally from Berkeley, California in the U.S. and was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. His personality, like some of these characters, is a category that has maybe added a few points to the scale as his character's been developed over the years. At first, he's kind of a brute, doesn't really have much to say in terms of intelligence, but over the years he's developed more of a conscience, more of a soul, and become more nuanced as a character, which means that gets him up to a 3 for personality. Powers 4, and you can maybe even make an argument for 5, depending on how enhanced he is mystically. So he has essentially limitless strength and durability, and once he starts moving, you can't stop him. So he's an unstoppable juggernaut, and he's invulnerable, and he has a healing factor for those rare occasions, and I'll get to those in a second, where he may be injured. And the Juggernaut is powered by the mystical entity Cyttorak, who of course interacts a lot with Doctor Strange. And the Crimson Gem of Cyttorak, the ruby, is what the Juggernaut discovered in a cave during the Korean War, and that's what gave him his powers. So if his power flow can be severed from that gem and from Cyttorak, then he lowers, he's lowered down to just standard human. He's not a mutant. He gets all his powers from the magical entity of Cyttorak. So in that sense, he is limited in that his power doesn't come from himself. At the same time, it's such an immense power that it is capable is the word I was looking for, capable of taking on someone like the Hulk. Of course, Colossus from the X-Men is also quite strong, so that's always a fun fight between those two. But Juggernaut, upper echelon of strength in the Marvel Universe. The only reason he doesn't get up to a 5 is because his power is so dependent upon another entity, as opposed to just himself. Mythology 5, and Juggernaut has some really, really cool stories. He's got some great stories against the X-Men, great stories against Spider-Man, and some great stories on his own, including when he becomes a hero and joins the X-Men for a while. So he's shown up in basically every, well, I don't want to say every, but quite a few major X-Men stories, and of course, has ventured into the realms of like Doctor Strange, Thor, a bunch of other X-Men heroes, and of course the benefit of Juggernaut from a writer's standpoint is that he is mystical and not mutant at all in origin. So that opens a few more doors to storytelling with him. Design is a 4, and sometimes he has gotten a little clunky in costume design, but the red armor and helmet has grown very iconic in Marvel lore and is also a huge part of his mythology in that the helmet protects him from mental attacks like his half-brother, Professor X. And that, of course, contributes to the mythology aspect of it, too, in that he has that connection with Professor X. So his design sits at a 4, as well as his cultural impact. He has appeared in many Marvel animated series. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, of course, X-Men, X-Men Evolution, Wolverine and the X-Men, Ultimate Spider-Man, Superhero Squad. He's shown up in a bunch of video games, Captain America and the Avengers, X2, X-Men Legends, even Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. You can play as Juggernaut in Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2, X-Men Legends 2, and Lego Marvel Superheroes. And he is super fun to play at because he just can crash through everything. It's a blast to just run around the Lego city and destroy everything with Juggernaut. Vinnie Jones, unfortunately, played Juggernaut. Nothing against Vinnie, but the character was written very poorly in X-Men The Last Stand. And he also shows up as, you may say, one of the main antagonists in Deadpool 2, where he is voiced and played via motion capture by Ryan Reynolds. And that version of him is much more accurate to the comics. So that puts him at a grand total of 20. Number 2, we have the Sentinels. And again, I'm making an exception here to my dislike of using groups as villains, because villainy, I feel like, is more measured in an individual's capacity for it. But the Sentinels have been such a huge thorn in the X-Men side, and they're much more than just robots, in that they developed their own artificial intelligence, had people like Nimrod and Master Mold, I shouldn't say people, members of the Sentinels, robots, Nimrod, Master Mold, some other notable names. So that's why they're included here. They don't have any real names, of course, except I mentioned those few, and those are other names that don't apply, of course, to the whole Sentinel squad, as you might call it. They first showed up in X-Men 14 in 1965, and their place of origin is New York in the United States. That's where they were first manufactured, and they were created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Their personality sits at a 2, and they're robots. They don't have individual personalities except for the rare case, such as Master Mold and Nimrod. Bastion is another one. And that's why they get a slight uptick to 2 from 1, which is where normal robots would get theirs, considering their personality is artificial, literally. Powers 4. And of course, it depends on which version of Sentinels you're talking about. Sentinels from a story like Days of Future Past are much more developed than the original Sentinels. So you may have the early Sentinels where I might classify their power ranking as more of a 2, but future Sentinels like Nimrod, for example, or Master Mold, much more powerful. So we kind of go with the upper level with that because they're easily adaptable. They don't have any empathy generally, so they sit at 4. Mythology 5. Days of Future Past is, of course, one of the greatest X-Men stories of all time, and that is the Sentinels, who are the villains. They were originally created by Bolivar Trask and designed to protect humans, quote-unquote. No, humans shouldn't be in quotes. Humans from the danger, quote-unquote. That's what I was going for, of mutants. And, of course, in typical evil robot fashion, they said, well, the best way to protect humans is to protect them from themselves, and rebelled against humans as well and became a nuisance to them as well as the mutants. Actually, Bolivar Trask, their inventor, sacrificed his own life to stop them in their first foray into the comic book world. Of course, they were revived later by other scientists such as Valerie Cooper, Henry Gyrick, Larry Trask, who is the son of Bolivar, Stephen Lang, quite a few other names sprinkled in there throughout the years, both human and actually mutant as well. Sentinels have shown up, if we're jumping quick to cultural impact, because that's the easy thing to do here, they've shown up in almost every film, television show, and video game series that's featured the X-Men. Of course, Days of Future Past, the video game X-Men Legends, X-Men animated series, they show up, side mission antagonists in Lego Marvel Superheroes, the game, and you can actually unlock a mini Sentinel as a playable character. So they get cultural impact of 5, and just that they're so intertwined with the X-Men and always showing up to cause problems. Design, they sit at 4. Some really cool looking Sentinels and some really ugly looking Sentinels, but they mostly land on the cool looking side. And if not cool looking, at least menacing and creepy looking with the weird semi-quasi-human face that we see on this picture here. So they get a total of 20 for their final score. Which brings us to the obvious number 1, Magneto himself. Of course, Magneto's gone by quite a few names throughout the years. Magnus is one, Eric Lenscher is one, Max Eisenhart is the name the comics give us as his actual original name. He first appeared along with the X-Men in X-Men number 1 in September of 1963. One of the few Marvel nemesis, arch nemesis, that appeared in the first issue that his nemesis also appeared in. So X-Men and Magneto both appeared in X-Men number 1. The Mandarin did not appear in Iron Man's first appearance, for example. Kingpin doesn't show up in Daredevil's first appearance. Doctor Doom doesn't show up in the Fantastic Four's first appearance, but Magneto there from the beginning, of course. Place of origin, Nuremberg, Germany. He is a Holocaust survivor, of course, and he was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And for his power scale, you see he's got 5s across the board. And so we're just going to kind of throw everything in there at once because there's not really a reason to differentiate between all of these. Magneto is probably the most iconic villain in Marvel history, as some other villains such as Loki have increased in popularity through the years. He may see some threats, but really, even though his depictions on the big screen are inconsistent, Magneto is still the most iconic villain in Marvel history. And that is partially because of his powers, partially because of his history, partially because of his philosophy, and also just that he's always been there, fighting the X-Men very early on in Marvel history. And he does join the X-Men at a few points in his career, but he's intertwined with them more so than any villain is with their corresponding heroes. And he's quite a tragic character, quite easy to empathize with and see where he's coming from. And in fact, in X-Men First Class, the movie, there's that exchange that always really hits me when Professor X tells him, killing will not bring you peace, and Magneto says peace was never an option. And such a great line. So, like I said, he's a Holocaust survivor. He's basically the antithesis of Professor X. He believes mutants should use whatever means necessary to prevent themselves from essentially what happened to the Jewish people, Magneto's own people. He has started the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, Asteroid M, Avalon. Almost every endeavor of Magneto's is an effort to secure peace for mutants, even if it meant the death of regular humans, which, unfortunately for humans, has happened quite frequently. There's a few times where he has joined the X-Men roster, and more recently he's become more sympathetic to humans, but he always has that dark side to him. He is one of very few Marvel characters that's actually appeared in an animated television show in every decade of Marvel's existence. So he showed up in the 60s Spider-Man cartoon, very loose adaptation of Magneto. In the 70s, Fantastic Four, he actually showed up as a villain. In the 80s, Spider-Man and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. And of course, his most famous animated rendition was in the 90s X-Men animated series. Of course, in the 2000s, X-Men Evolution and Wolverine and the X-Men. In the 2010s, he has shown up in Marvel Anime and Iron Man Armored Adventures. And I'm sure he will show up in this decade as well that just started this year, of course. Ian McKellen and Michael Fassbender portray him in the X-Men Fox film franchise. And in the video game realm, he is a boss enemy in dozens of Marvel games, X-Men and otherwise, and of course a playable character in several, including some of the Lego games, both Ultimate Alliance games, although one he's a DLC character, X-Men Legends 2, and X-Men 2 Clone Wars, which when I was a kid was super excited to play as Magneto. You could play as a villain, oh my gosh, for the first time, and fight up against the Phalanx in Clone Wars. Magneto, one of my favorites personally, and of course that opinion is shared by many. Classic Marvel villain and a great example of the skill of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and of course many Marvel writers and artists down the line in creating a compelling character. So perfect score for the Master of Magnetism, Magneto. So a quick review of our top 10 villains. Number 10, we have Changeling, who of course later called Morph in the animated series. Also, fun little factoid is Morph got so popular that they actually had to create another character named Morph and bring him in from another alternate reality. So he's part of the Exiles, at least at his beginning of his career. So Changeling is number 10. Number 9, Mesmero the Hypnotist. Number 9, Vanisher, Telford Porter, classic. Number 7, Sauron. Number 6, The Blob. Number 5, Mastermind. Number 4, Toad. Number 3, Juggernaut. Number 2 is the Sentinels. And of course, number 1, Magneto himself. So thanks again, everybody, for watching. Make sure you subscribe. Next week, we're going to probably take a look at Daredevil and see where his villains hail from. Kingpin is not included, actually, because he does not run into Daredevil at all in the 60s. So you're going to have to pay special attention to see some of Daredevil's original nemesis. Sounds good. Anyway, see you next time. Subscribe, and thanks for watching Bring On the Bad Guys.